Chicago has long been known as the hub of rail traffic in the United States. In addition to playing host to just about every major freight railroad in the country, it is also the epicenter of Amtrak's long-distance passenger trains, with Chicago Union Station being an endpoint for more than half of all of Amtrak's long-distance routes. The network of rail lines in and out of downtown Chicago is incredibly complex, with routes splitting off in just about every direction. To better understand the flow of Amtrak trains in and out of the city, let's pay a visit to downtown Chicago to watch just about every long-distance and intercity train arriving and departing on a typical day. While covering every single rail line into and out of the city is well beyond the scope of this video, we will cover every route Amtrak trains take on their journeys into and out of Union Station. All of the trains seen in this video were filmed in June of 2022. To give you a full appreciation of what a typical day's worth of train traffic looks like, I've combined footage across 3 different days of filming. Our primary focus will be on 2 different train watching locations in downtown. The 18th Street Bridge passes above the railroad on the south end of Amtrak's yard in downtown Chicago, just north of where the railroad crosses over the Chicago River's South Fork. Roosevelt Road crosses above the railroad just to the north of the Amtrak yard, with a view of the approach tracks into Union Station. Both locations offer a great vantage of Chicago's city skyline. We'll start out at the 18th Street Bridge for the purpose of getting a feel for all the different rail lines in the immediate vicinity of Union Station. As a little bit of background, Chicago at one time had 6 different terminals in downtown that were used for long-distance passenger trains. Today, only Chicago Union Station at 225 South Canal Street plays host to long-distance Amtrak services. Amtrak is the current owner of the station. The other 3 passenger terminals currently used in downtown are used only for Metra and Chicago South Shore commuter trains. Union Station is a run-through terminal, meaning that the station tracks pass all the way through. This allows trains to enter and exit the terminal from both the north and the south. To the north, Chicago Metra's rail line, known as the C&M subdivision, carries trains in the direction of Milwaukee. This line is a former Pennsylvania Railroad route as far as the Western Avenue Bridge in downtown Chicago, and then former Milwaukee Road for the rest of the journey north. On the south side of the station, the BNSF Chicago subdivision takes Amtrak and Metra passenger trains between downtown Chicago and Aurora to the west. This route once belonged to the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad. Also exiting from the south side of the terminal is Norfolk Southern's former Pennsylvania Railroad Chicago line, carrying both Metra and Amtrak out of Union Station and due south across the river on the Canal Street Vertical Lift Bridge. This was the Pennsylvania Railroad's main line to the East Coast and was used by many famous trains, including the Broadway Limited. Another critical artery for passenger trains coming into Chicago is the Canadian National Freeport subdivision, a former Illinois Central rail line. While this route does not directly take passenger trains into and out of Union Station, it serves as an important connector. Just south of the bridge over the Chicago River, the NS Chicago line and the CN Freeport subdivision cross each other. Connector tracks allow Amtrak trains coming from both directions on the Freeport subdivision to transfer to Norfolk Southern rails for the last mile of the journey into the terminal. With all this train traffic coming into downtown, the Chicago River Bridge is an essential piece of infrastructure leading into Union Station. Breakdowns of the bridge can create major headaches for the railroad. There is a 5th rail line worth mentioning before we begin to watch some trains. The St. Charles Air Line is a short east-west section of railroad that was built in the 1850s and once served as a connector between the Canadian National on the east side of the Chicago River and the Union Pacific Global 1 and BNSF Cicero yards on the west side of the river. Originally, the line was intended to connect Chicago with the Mississippi River by way of St. Charles, Illinois. However, the railroad never left the city limits of Chicago. The term airline is an older railroad designation referring to the fact that the route was planned to be more direct than other lines. Two double-track bascule bridges once handled train traffic over the Chicago River, with a combination of steel girder and concrete construction carrying the railroad over the Norfolk Southern Chicago line and BNSF Chicago subdivision. Today, it is jointly owned by Canadian National, BNSF, and Union Pacific. While the line has been out of service for the last few years, plans are in the works to use a portion of the St. Charles line to give Amtrak a more direct route into Union Station, but more on that later. On a weekday morning, just after the end of the morning commuter rush, Amtrak P42 locomotive number 54 comes off the connector track from the BNSF Chicago subdivision, entering the Norfolk Southern Chicago line. The junction between these two rail lines forms an arrangement of track known in railroading as a Y. The Y allows rail equipment to be turned around in a sort of three-point turn for trains. Locomotive 54 was in the process of being turned around for use on an Amtrak train later in the day. The locomotive pulls just past the Lumber Street Railroad crossing, a switch is thrown, and the engineer backs number 54 into the Amtrak 18th Street yard to await its next assignment. A short time elapses, and then Amtrak train number 371, the Pere Marquette, arrives from Grand Rapids, Michigan. Charger locomotive 4622 brings the short three-car train past the Amtrak locomotive facility and into Union Station. The train will arrive a few minutes early this morning, pulling in just after 9 a.m. The Pere Marquette is one of only a handful of Amtrak Midwest intercity trains to operate with superliner coaches. It travels along the shore of Lake Michigan on the NS Chicago line to reach Union Station. This routing is shared with all other Michigan service intercity trains between Chesterton, Indiana and Chicago, along with the long-distance Lakeshore Limited from Boston and New York and the Capital Limited from Washington, D.C. About a half hour later, combined Lincoln service and Missouri River Runner train number 319, bound for St. Louis and Kansas City, Missouri, begins its journey out of Chicago. On the end of this train are four new Siemens Mobility Venture passenger cars purchased by Illinois for intercity trains. At the time this scene was filmed, Train 319 was one of only a couple of trains to use this equipment. Since then, more cars have been approved for service, and use of the Venture cars has expanded to other routes. A temporary lull in the train action allows for some time to take a closer look at the Amtrak 18th Street Locomotive facility. Multiple different generations of passenger diesel-electric locomotives are all in view. On the far left is a former EMD-built F40PH locomotive that has been depowered and turned into a cab control car for intercity service. The F40s were the primary diesel power for Amtrak from the late 1970s up until the mid-1990s, with the last locomotives retired in 2002. One track over is a 6-year-old Siemens SC44 Charger locomotive. 33 of these units were purchased by the state of Illinois for intercity Amtrak trains in the Midwest. Behind and to the right, a General Electric P42 locomotive basks in the sun. These locomotives have been with Amtrak since the mid-1990s, and after more than a quarter century are finally being replaced with the long-distance variant of the Siemens Charger. Finally, in the front on the right, a pair of GE-8 locomotives idle away. These were built in 1991 as extra motive power prior to the arrival of the GE P40 and P42 locomotives. They were off-the-shelf freight units with a few internal modifications for passenger service. Today, the locomotives are primarily used for yard and work train service but will be retired in the near future. Running a little over an hour behind schedule, the Capital Limited, train number 29, rolls across the Chicago River Bridge on approach into Union Station. The Capital Limited travels in between Washington, D.C. and Chicago on a combination of CSX and Norfolk Southern-owned tracks. In the days of streamlined passenger trains in the U.S., it was operated by the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. From a location slightly further east on 18th Street, we see the City of New Orleans, train number 58, as it approaches Chicago Union Station, running 50 minutes late. This train originated in New Orleans, Louisiana, and traveled through the night over Canadian National's former Illinois Central rails to get to Chicago. Prior to the formation of Amtrak, this was an Illinois Central train. The City of New Orleans leaves the CN Chicago subdivision and enters the Freeport sub for a very brief stretch. Train 58 takes the connector from Canadian National tracks and onto the Norfolk Southern Chicago line. Once the train has fully entered NS trackage, a switch is thrown and the train reverses across the river and into Union Station. This extra step is required for all Amtrak passenger trains traveling on this section of the Canadian National to get to Chicago. All of Amtrak's intercity trains from Carbondale, Illinois must also perform this same switching move upon arrival in the Windy City. For trains leaving Chicago, the exact opposite move occurs. The train will back out of Union Station and across the Chicago River, and then reverse directions, traveling forward onto the Canadian National for the trip to southern Illinois. This unusual reverse move was in part necessitated when Amtrak consolidated all their operations in Chicago to run out of Union Station. When the Illinois Central Railroad operated the city of New Orleans, the train terminated at Chicago Central Station, which was located approximately where the current 11th Street station on the Metra electric line is located. Central Station was demolished in 1974 following the Amtrak takeover of passenger service from the Illinois Central. The Chicago Regional Environmental and Transportation Efficiency Project, abbreviated as CREATE, is a long-term effort to expedite rail traffic and eliminate bottlenecks on several rail routes in Chicago. One of the individual projects of the CREATE program is the construction of a brand new connector track from the St. Charles Airline directly to tracks leading into Union Station. This would see the elimination once and for all of the City of New Orleans reverse moves into and out of Chicago. After another half hour of waiting, Amtrak's Wolverine, train number 351, approaches its destination at 10:33 a.m. Train 351 is the first Chicago-bound Wolverine train of the day. It originated in Pontiac, Michigan, with a stop in Detroit along the way. Amtrak has proposed rerouting all of the Michigan service trains, including the Wolverine, as well as the Capital Limited and Lakeshore Limited, onto the Canadian National route currently used by the City of New Orleans. The trains would use the CN to get to the south side of Chicago and would then use South Shoreline tracks to get to Indiana and Michigan. By doing this, Amtrak trains could avoid the regular delays caused by the heavy freight traffic on the Norfolk Southern Chicago line. While no timeline for the reroute has been established, it will occur no sooner than the construction of the new St. Charles Airline connector track. "20 minutes later, the train set for the Pere Marquette is turned on the Y for the afternoon return trip to Grand Rapids. At 11:08 a.m., an hour and 30-minute late Lincoln service train number 300 from St. Louis comes across the Canal Street Bridge. Lincoln service trains travel over the Canadian National Joliet subdivision between Joliet and Chicago. About 2 miles before reaching Norfolk Southern's Chicago line and the Chicago River, the Joliet sub joins up with the CN Freeport subdivision. Trains use this short segment of the Freeport sub to reach the NS line into Union Station. 10 minutes later, the Capital Limited is turned and then backed into the yard for servicing. The Capital Limited is the only train from Chicago to the East Coast to use bi-level superliner cars. About 11:30, the Blue Water, train number 365, arrives from Port Huron, Michigan. The Blue Water runs with an SC-44 Charger locomotive on each end due to a lack of turning facilities in Port Huron. On its journey across Michigan, the train regularly travels at speeds in excess of 100 miles per hour. With a combined 8,800 horsepower, the 6-car train likely has little trouble achieving these speeds. The City of New Orleans equipment set is next up for a turn at the Y. Since the train will have to back out of Chicago again this evening, the locomotives are turned to face into Union Station for the 8 p.m. departure. As the City of New Orleans train set pulls into the yard, Lincoln Service Train 302 arrives 10 minutes ahead of schedule. Locomotive 4619 leads the train into Chicago. Following another 10 minutes of waiting, Lincoln Service Train 300's set of equipment is turned. Just 10 more minutes later, an over 2-hour late Amtrak Cardinal, Train 51, approaches Chicago. This train runs 3 days per week in each direction, the only tri-weekly train in and out of the Windy City. The Cardinal is a long-distance train traveling in between New York, Washington, D.C., and Chicago by way of the Appalachia Mountains and West Virginia's scenic New River Gorge. This train has a unique and somewhat awkward route into Chicago. After spending most of its journey on rails owned by CSX, the Cardinal travels back and forth between tracks owned by multiple railroads, first on Canadian National, then on Union Pacific rails, followed by a very short stretch on the Belt Railroad of Chicago and Metra, and then finally onto the NS Chicago line for the last couple miles into downtown. With the Cardinal out of the way, the Blue Water train set is moved into the yard, first coming across the Canal Street Bridge and then reversing directions. Running nearly 2.5 hours late, the Lakeshore Limited, Train 49, arrives into Chicago. Locomotive number 109 on the front of the train is the last Amtrak P42DC type to retain its original nose. All other units in the Genesis fleet have had new fiberglass nose sections installed. Amtrak's Lakeshore Limited traces its roots to the New York Central Railroad. Two different sections of the train originate in Boston and New York City. The train is combined in Albany, New York for the overnight journey to Chicago. Train 49 passes under the St. Charles Airline as it nears its destination. High traffic levels of NS freight trains on the Chicago line frequently lead to delays on the Capital Limited, Lakeshore Limited, and Michigan Service trains. I took a break for lunch and then changed locations. A parking garage at Roosevelt Road provides a great vantage of the Amtrak and Metra yards in downtown Chicago. Several new Amtrak Midwest Siemens Venture cars can be seen sitting in front of the 18th Street shop building. These cars are waiting for final approval from the state of Illinois to enter service. A little further in the distance, several Amtrak locomotives are within view. Amtrak-8 number 504 and brand new Siemens ALC 42 locomotive 303 sit next to each other. At the time this was filmed, 303 was just a month into long-distance Amtrak service. Down on the Roosevelt Road Bridge, Amtrak's Texas Eagle from San Antonio, train number 22, waits for clearance into Union Station. The train passes a Metra commuter set moving into the yard for servicing. On this day, the train would arrive into Chicago 20 minutes early. The Lakeshore Limited train set backs out of Union Station for its turn on the Y. This train will be serviced before departing for the East Coast this evening at 9:30 p.m. At 1:45 p.m., the outbound Texas Eagle, Train 21, makes an on-time departure bound for San Antonio. The Texas Eagle shares its route with the Lincoln Service intercity trains in between Chicago and St. Louis, Missouri. Running 1 hour behind schedule, northbound Saluki, train 390 arrives into Chicago from Carbondale. This train traverses the same route as the city of New Orleans over its entire journey. P42 number 68 was filling in for a charger on this particular day. As Amtrak P42-63 switches two cars in the yard, Wolverine Train 353 arrives into Chicago just a few minutes behind schedule. Seconds after the Wolverine disappears into the darkness under the U.S. Post Office building, the California Zephyr, Train 5, emerges bound for Emeryville and the San Francisco Bay Area. This train, along with the Southwest Chief, Illinois Zephyr, and Carl Sandburg, travel west from Chicago on the busy BNSF Chicago subdivision, often nicknamed the Racetrack. Prior to Amtrak, the California Zephyr was jointly operated by the Western Pacific, Rio Grande, and Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy railroads. Five minutes later, eastbound Wolverine train 352 makes an on-time departure from Chicago. We take a brief break from the south side of the station to move to Des Plaines Street. From this vantage, we can now see trains departing north out of Union Station onto the Metra-owned C&M subdivision. The tracks come around a curve out of the terminal and head due west as they pass under the road. Above, tracks leading into one of the other downtown Chicago Metra terminals can be seen. These are used by Metra's Union Pacific North Line services. Empire Builder Train Number 7, destined for Seattle and Portland, comes around the curve out of Union Station, meeting an inbound Metra commuter train. Before Amtrak, this train was operated by the Great Northern Railway. It was previously routed on the Racetrack straight west out of Chicago before turning to the north toward Minnesota. When Amtrak took over, the train was rerouted through Milwaukee on the former Milwaukee Road to improve service in Wisconsin. Amtrak Hiawatha Train 336 heads south into Chicago for an on-time arrival. The Hiawathas are Illinois and Wisconsin state-supported trains that run multiple trips per day between Chicago and Milwaukee. They typically operate with F40 cab cars on the south end of the train and a locomotive on the north end. Moving back down to Roosevelt Road in the south side of Union Station, the train set from Saluki Train 390 leaves Union Station for the coach yard. The Saluki and the Illini are the two Illinois state-supported trains that run in between Chicago and Carbondale. When these scenes were filmed in June of 2022, the morning southbound Saluki and the afternoon northbound Illini were both temporarily suspended. The Southwest Chief, Train 3, departs Chicago at 2:50 p.m. bound for Los Angeles. This train traces its heritage to the Santa Fe Railroad. It will travel over the BNSF Chicago subdivision as it heads out of the city. Moving back to the north, Hiawatha Train 337 leaves Chicago for Milwaukee. This is the same equipment set that arrived 45 minutes earlier on Train 336. Jumping again down to Roosevelt Road, the train set for Amtrak's Blue Water moves into Union Station to prepare for its 4 p.m. departure. Charger Locomotive 4619 backs out of Union Station to be turned for a Wolverine train later in the afternoon. The structure to the right is a coal-burning power plant built in 1931 that was used for decades to supply electricity to Union Station. It was shut down in 2011, and Amtrak has since made plans to demolish the structure. This has prompted several groups to push for the building's preservation. Charger 4618 leads Blue Water Train 364 out of Union Station. In years past, this train was known as the International and carried passengers all the way to Toronto, Ontario. With a little break in the action, I returned one more time to the 18th Street Bridge on the south side of downtown. Amtrak's Dash 8 Phase 3 50th Anniversary Locomotive, number 160, was shining in the sun outside of the engine servicing facility. Lincoln Service Train 305 leaves Chicago for the 5.5-hour trip to St. Louis. The cafe car on the end of the train, number 48185, was used for many years on the San Diegan trains between Los Angeles and San Diego, California. It bore the name City of San Diego on a raised placard under the windows and directly above the car number in the middle of the car. The placard is still in place, but the name was removed long ago. Right on the heels of Train 305 is the Carbondale-bound Illini, Train 393. Charger 4606 backs the train out of Chicago about an hour and 20 minutes behind schedule due to the earlier late arrival of northbound Train 390. With a brief break in train traffic, the train set from the inbound Texas Eagle is turned on the Y as two -8 locomotives switch the coach yard in the background. Charger 4619 is now on the point of Wolverine Train 354 as it leaves Chicago on time just before 6 p.m. Immediately after the Wolverine was through, an outbound Metra commuter train makes its way south. This train is bound for Manhattan, Illinois on Metra's Southwest Service line. As the Metra train passes, the Chicago-bound California Zephyr, train number 6, can be seen arriving in the distance. The train was running about 3 hours behind schedule on this day. Right on the heels of the Metra, another train appears. This is the eastbound Cardinal, train number 50. With all this train traffic, it's easy to see why Chicago is known as the railroad capital of the United States. As the afternoon shadows grow long, Pere Marquette Train 370 leaves Chicago for Grand Rapids. A near 4-hour late Southwest Chief Train 4 can be seen rounding the curve on the BNSF Chicago sub on approach into Union Station. As the Chief disappears behind the St. Charles Airline Bridge, the train set from inbound Amtrak Empire Builder Train 8 curves around to the west to be turned on the Y. Just after 6:40 p.m., our last train of the day, Capital Limited Train 30, departs Chicago. The other long-distance trains, the outbound City of New Orleans and Lake Shore Limited, would both depart Chicago after nightfall. Well, that does it for our day of watching Amtrak trains in downtown Chicago. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you found this video helpful in describing the Amtrak train traffic in and out of the Windy City. There were a few trains that I wasn't able to show, such as the Illinois Zephyr and the Carl Sandburg, but we covered pretty much everything else. If you have any questions about this video or requests for future video topics, let me know in the comments section below. As always, a big thanks to all my supporters on Patreon. For notifications every time I post a new video, click on the subscribe button and select the Receive All Notifications option by clicking on the bell. I'll see you next Friday at 9 a.m. Pacific Time for an all-new railroad-themed adventure right here on the YouTube channel. That's it for now. Until next time, I'm Mike Armstrong. I'll see you down the line. Thanks for watching.